This channel is part of the History Hit network.
For over a century, the Palace of Versailles was home to the most powerful family in Europe. A place of artistic brilliance, lavish entertainment, passionate love affairs, and outrageous scandals. But while a lucky few danced, feasted, and flirted their days away, the state was on the brink of collapse. Outside these gilded gates, millions of ordinary people were taxed to the hilt, while rich nobles paid virtually nothing. A new king, Louis XVI, and his beautiful young queen, Marie Antoinette, faced the biggest challenge in the history of their illustrious family. Bring fairness to the system and hope to their subjects, or face losing their palace, their crowns, and their heads. In 1775, Versailles celebrated the coronation of a new king and queen. Louis XVI had lived most of his 20 years here, surrounded by courtiers and power brokers. But like his young Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette, he didn't feel ready to rule.
Dieu m'est témoin que je n'ai pas voulu cela.
Seigneur, protégez-nous. Nous régnons si jeunes.
Despite their king's private feelings, the public had high hopes.
He's young, he has a beautiful wife, so there's everything to expect from this new and hopefully glorious reign of Louis XVI.
Louis XVI wants to rule in the grand manner. He wants to be an absolute monarch. He wants to live up to the style of Louis the Great, Louis XIV. But interestingly, he wants also to rule in a way which is popular.
To be truly popular, Louis knew that he had to govern in the interest of all his people, and not just the ones he had grown up with.
Sire, le projet de réaménagement complet de l'Hôtel-Dieu, ainsi que celui de la création d'un nouvel hôpital.
Je contribuerai sur mes fonds propres. Et tous ceux qui n'ont pas une pierre à la place du cœur contribueront aussi. Nous voulons voir ces travaux se
In keeping with the Enlightenment, he's going to be a slightly more modern king. He has ambitions to be a just and a philanthropic monarch. He calls himself Louis the Bienfaisant, Louis the Philanthropic.
In fact, one of his first decisions was so modern that it quite terrified his courtiers.
Sire, renoncez, je vous en supplie une dernière fois.
Ne me dois-je pas de donner l'exemple?
Pas s'il y va de votre vie.
He had his whole family inoculated against smallpox, using a procedure that was experimental and very dangerous.
That was something which, raised hairs at the time. People thought, oh, what will happen if he dies? And I think in that way, the king took the lead. He showed that he could lead with the times and move with the times. And that was a promising start to the reign.
Louis and Marie Antoinette seemed happy and relaxed in public. But behind the smiles, there was a problem with the royal marriage. A big one.
The marriage was, in one way, a disaster. If you say that the point of the marriage was to produce heirs who would combine the blood of the Austrian royal family and the French royal family, well, that wasn't going to happen because poor Louis XVI simply couldn't, wouldn't, or didn't try to consummate the marriage.
A king and queen's sex life, or lack of one, was an important matter of state. So it didn't take long for news of Louis's failings in the bedchamber to spread around Versailles.
It's so embarrassing, a situation where all the courtiers hung about the bridal chamber. I mean, it's inconceivable to us that they were allowed to do that, and sort of more or less said, "How was it for you, sir?" And nothing happened, and he didn't consummate it for a long time.
Precisely what was going on behind the bedroom door mystified the courtiers and divides historians to this day.
For the first 7 years of the marriage, there is clearly a sexual problem. And certainly that either the couple do not have sex, or they don't have sufficient sex, or they're not sufficiently instructed in sexual matters to actually produce pregnancies and children.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We work with some of the world's best historians, like Susanna Lipscomb, Mary Beard and Tony Robinson, exploring everything from the jobs of Tudor England to the diaries of Queen Victoria. Not only that, but we have a huge podcast network, releasing new episodes every day, so you'll always have something to listen to. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
Given the legendary sexual exploits of Louis XIV and XV, it's hard to believe that number 16 was such a blushing innocent.
It does seem extraordinary that he wouldn't have known how to do it, but apparently he didn't. What he would do is put his penis inside the Queen's vagina, leave it there without moving for 2 minutes, and then withdraw. The Queen would leave his bed, and he would then have a happy ending on his own.
But some believe it wasn't ignorance that stopped Louis from doing his royal duty, it was illness. A rare medical condition called phimosis, which meant that lovemaking was more pain than pleasure.
It's possible that Louis XVI had a malformation which needed to be corrected by minor surgery before he could have full sexual relations.
And at various times, an operation of circumcision was discussed to correct this. But in fact, this was found not really to be the case.
Luckily, we have his hunting diary. And I went to top experts on the subject of phimosis, which is what he would have had if he needed an operation. And they assured me, when I showed them the hunting diary, which he wrote, no one who'd had an operation for phimosis without anaesthetic could possibly have gone hunting day after day after day. Without going into details, it's unthinkable.
While Louis struggled to father a child with Marie Antoinette, he also had to address the problem that had blighted the final years of Louis XV's reign, the poor state of the national finances. He hired one of the sharpest minds in Europe, Anne-Robert Turgo, to advise him on the economy.
Monsieur Turgo, le bien de mon peuple. Je veux que cet objectif seul guide tout entier votre action.
France was a society which still lived on the margins of subsistence. Many people still had memories of the terrible famines that had killed millions at the end of the reign of Louis XIV.
Je vous soutiendrai, Monsieur Turgo. Je vous soutiendrai.
Turgo is an enlightened minister who has a particular sense of the importance of landed wealth and the need to tax landed wealth.
Savez-vous ce que représente une telle miche de pain pour les plus pauvres des sujets du royaume?
Je vous croyais en charge des finances, Monsieur Turgo. Je ne savais pas que vous étiez aussi boulanger.
Les 3/4 du budget d'une famille.
Turgot tried to teach the king and his ministers some lessons about life outside Versailles, like the price of bread. Louis was interested. The others, not so much.
Nous allons mettre en œuvre vos réformes, Turgo. Vous ferez préparer les projets de loi.
Louis XVI really does begin his reign with modernising and adventurous policies. So this is a modern, forward-looking king who would hope to reform France and to help France regain its status in the world, as well as the leading European power.
Louis's enthusiasm for reform was not shared by most of his courtiers. The palace was full of powerful, landed aristocrats, many of them Louis's own relatives. If Turgot's reforms went through, they would have to pay taxes like everyone else, for the first time in their lives. And they didn't like that idea at all.
Versailles is becoming an increasingly isolated little world. Nobles who are living uselessly spending money, relying on court pensions, utterly oblivious to the political issues in France.
Comment vouliez-vous que les tiers états n'en viennent pas au coup d'éclat?
Certain taxes were not paid by the nobility, notably the tie. Poll tax simply wasn't paid by anyone. Now, Louis XVI thought this was wrong and aimed to end it.
Vous croyez donc invincible, Monsieur Turgot?
Ce n'est pas tout, sire.
But Turgot's reforms had to be accepted by France's highest law court, the Parlement. Its members, like most of Louis's own governing council, were outraged by his ideas.
Mais si les parlements refusent d'enregistrer ces nouvelles lois, nous les ferons enregistrer par la force.
Par la force? Vous croyez donc invincible, Monsieur Turgot? Vous croyez entendre un de ces philosophes dont vous êtes si proche?
Opposition to Turgot's reforms came from within the council, very conservative men who felt that the sorts of things that Turgot was proposing threatened the traditional structure of society, in which nobles and clergy held a privileged position relative to the rest of society.
Imposition rapporterait.
Vous allez trop loin, messieurs. Nous ne pouvons nous mettre à dos tout à la fois la noblesse et le clergé.
C'est assez. Je lirai et vous ferai connaître mon sentiment.
And so he had, if you will, stirred up the hornet's nest of vested interest.
Queen Marie Antoinette loved to dance and gamble in the most fashionable Parisian salons, where she heard all the gossip against Turgot.
Votre nuit fut-elle bonne?
La fête était magnifique, oui. Je meurs de sommeil, il me tarde de me coucher.
Pour moi, je m'en vais de ce pas remettre ma vie entre les mains de Monsieur Turgot.
Vous savez qu'il se répand un mot de moins en moins couvert que les réformes préparées par Monsieur Turgot ne visent à rien moins qu'à saper les fondements mêmes de la monarchie.
Je vous laisse libre de vos sorties. Laissez-moi libre de mes avis.
Louis, mieux que tout autre, devrait se souvenir que notre société est fondée sur la distinction et la hiérarchie des trois ordres.
One of the most powerful opponents of reform was the king's own brother, the Comte de Provence, known in court simply as Monsieur. He clung to the traditional order of French society, 3 estates under the king: the clergy, the nobility, and the rest, with only the rest paying taxes.
Sur un même pied, la noblesse et le commun.
The gossip in Paris, combined with the strong vocal opposition inside Versailles, began to undermine Louis's faith in Turgot and reform.
Louis XVI must not have known which way to turn because the economists are divided, and fundamentally the issue of is the French state and whether it will survive. Very momentous decisions for a young man to take.
Diable d'homme de Turgot. Ne prend-il donc jamais une minute de repos?
He looked initially as if he was going to stand firm. However, his confidence was undermined. Louis XVI lacked the willingness to support him to the bitter end.
Est-ce qu'il ne va quand même pas un peu trop vite? Vous, Monsieur Turgot, ne savez aller que vent debout.
Despite his promises of support, Louis eventually dismissed the man he'd recruited to save the French economy.
Puissiez-vous ne jamais oublier que c'est sa faiblesse qui a mis la tête du roi d'Angleterre Charles Ier sur le billot.
He is famously said to have remarked, Monsieur Turgot wants to be me. I don't want him to be me. And for that reason, the minister was disgraced.
Je me garderai bien de le faire, mais le public, lui, vous demandera de vous expliquer.
Je n'en ferai rien. J'aime mieux laisser interpréter mes silences que mes paroles.
His treatment of Turgot made Louis look weak and indecisive, labels that would stick. But Louis did have something to celebrate. After 8 years of marriage, he and Marie Antoinette finally managed to start a family. First a daughter, and then an heir to the throne.
The birth of her second child, the Dauphin, was enormously important. She'd produced a son. She'd fulfilled her duty, and that was tremendously important and bolstered her, and the king was extremely pleased. Huge celebrations.
It was seen as a miracle. This little baby really was seen as a savior. He was the boy who was going to save France. The bells rang in Paris, the fountains flowed with wine, the Te Deum was sung. I mean, nothing was neglected.
Pour le bonheur des Français.
Pour répandre en nos cœurs.
Félicité parfaite.
Conserve au ciel le protecteur.
Les jours d'Antoinette.
France, tu vas renaître.
Un divin rejeton descendu des cieux.
Que sur un triple autel on célèbre ce jour.
Nos trois divinités bienveillantes.
Les Bourbons, l'Autriche et l'amour.
Aujourd'hui, il ne transporte encore que des animaux. J'ai expressément interdit à Monsieur Montgolfier d'y monter en raison du danger. Mais demain, il transportera des hommes. Soyons-en certains. Il ne faut pas le craindre, mais s'en réjouir.
Louis enjoyed being a father, and for a while began to enjoy being king. But the responsibilities of government weighed upon him every day, especially the urgent need to fill the national treasury. Louis's next attempt to do so arrived at Versailles in the shape of Jacques Necker, one of the wealthiest men in Europe.
Necker is an enormously rich Genevan banker. States like France's, which is having financial problems, finds it terrifically advantageous because it means that he places his personal credit to the benefit of the state. He's seen initially as a sort of miracle man because by establishing confidence, financial confidence, the state can boom.
Necker arrived at an exciting time in Versailles. France's old enemy, England, was struggling with an armed rebellion in its American colonies. A rebellion that Louis wanted to support.
C'est maintenant une véritable guerre d'indépendance que mènent les milices américaines contre les troupes anglaises.
La France, sire, ne doit pas s'engager plus.
France, since the defeats of the 7 Years' War, had been desperate to get revenge on England. Louis XVI would like nothing more than to attack the old enemy. But on the other hand, there's a problem. If they do that, are they not supporting insurgents? And indeed insurgents, many of whom were Republicans and avowed Republicans at that. And so it's difficult. And so to begin with, they take a kind of a middle course.
Monsieur Vergennes?
Nous ne pouvons fournir armes et munitions aux insurgés, mais nous pouvons leur donner les moyens d'en acheter à des personnes privées. Le gouvernement n'apparaîtra en rien.
Louis approved the aid, but insisted that everything was done in secret.
Using a certain amount of covert skullduggery, weapons and arms are sent off to help the Americans fight off the British attempt to reconquer the rebellious colonies.
All this assistance to America cost the French government a fortune, money it simply did not have. Louis turned to his new finance minister, and Necker arranged emergency loans from his banking friends. The world's first democratic revolution was being financed by one of the least democratic nations in Europe, a fact that troubled Louis himself.
Ne la laissons pas passer.
Les insurgés américains ne brandissent pas seulement le drapeau de la révolte contre l'Angleterre. Les buts qu'ils poursuivent sont opposés aux intérêts de la monarchie. N'ont-ils pas le projet, s'ils remportent la victoire, de créer une république?
L'Amérique est trop loin, sire, pour craindre une contagion.
Les idées aussi voyagent. Pour ce qui est de déclarer la guerre à l'Angleterre, je ne peux m'y résoudre. Mais nous devons nous préparer à une guerre défensive. Nous devons rénover et accroître notre flotte. Pour l'argent nécessaire, ce sera donc l'emprunt, Monsieur Necker.
After 2 years of war, Louis's investment in the American Revolution seemed to pay off when the rebels scored their first great victory at the Battle of Saratoga. He decided that the moment had come to support America publicly and go to war with Britain.
Aucune sorte d'envie de recevoir ce blanc-bec.
Non, je n'hésite pas à le
He
dire.
threw a huge party at Versailles to welcome one of the men who drafted America's Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin.
Les Anglais.
Louis and the nobles of Versailles didn't care that Franklin was a Democrat who did not believe in the rule of kings and princes. What appealed to them was the chance to do down a country they hated so much that they wore its image on their backsides.
The courtiers at Versailles loved Franklin because he was a Sude like they were. They dressed up as shepherdesses, he dressed up as a fur trapper.
Même si aujourd'hui nous vivons dans la nuit, nous avons allumé assez de bougies pour danser en attendant des jours nouveaux.
When Benjamin Franklin arrived in France, he was an absolute celebrity. There was a real sort of frenzy, really, a Franklin mania almost, as everybody wants to be seen with the great man.
Au ciel, il a arraché l'éclair et au tyran le sceptre.
The war may have been successful, but it was costing more every year that it dragged on. Finance Minister Necker had already borrowed up to the hilt and was now struggling to get a grip on royal spending.
Il faut, sire, réduire encore et encore le train de la maison du roi. C'est le prix si nous voulons imposer des économies à l'ensemble de vos courtisans.
War is increasingly expensive, and the French political system is not set up to impose taxes on the people who are best able to pay them. So the fundamental problem of the French state is how do you tax the rich?
Le seul moyen pour restaurer les finances publiques serait de rendre l'impôt obligatoire pour tous, mais vraiment pour tous. Et à ce moment-là, nous aurions le clergé et la noblesse contre nous. Et le Parlement n'enregistrerait pas notre loi.
Necker, after several years in government, had pretty much exhausted the possibility of borrowing. He was aware that it was necessary to raise taxes.
Pensions, gratifications et autres.
Necker published plans to get rid of the unnecessary but lucrative jobs enjoyed by the courtiers at Versailles. But even the suggestion of reining in the privileges of the nobles set off a familiar argument.
Pas près d'arriver, Monsieur Necker.
Écoutez la suite. Toute exception, toute faveur devient tôt ou tard une injustice envers la société.
Comment ce bourgeois protestant ose-t-il écrire de pareilles inepties?
Louis promised to back Necker all the way, just as he had with Turgo.
Je n'admettrai pas une nouvelle opposition comme au temps de M. Turgo. Ceux qui y trouveront à redire, je les casserai comme verre.
Si nous laissons faire Necker, la gloire de Louis XIV cédera bientôt le pas à l'anarchie la plus extrême. Puisque notre ministre se gargarise de mots, nous allons lui retourner.
Je ne suis décidément pas fait pour la colère, et encore moins pour la violence.
Marie Antoinette encouraged her husband to be strong this time, but once again, he began to dither.
Voilà que vous recommencez comme au départ de M. Turgo.
Je ne me soucie que de vous, Louis. Puissiez-vous cette fois ne pas reculer.
Louis XVI was not a decisive man by nature. He was a decent man. He was controlled more by his ministers than previous kings had been, but then he was facing a different situation.
Despite his wife's advice, Louis decided that Necker had to go. The The second attempt to confront the French nobility had ended just like the first one, in complete failure. When the British finally gave up fighting in America and recognized the new country's independence, it looked like Louis had achieved a famous victory. But even as Versailles celebrated, his courtiers were whispering that France was not getting what it expected from a war it had financed on borrowed money.
77 navires. Nous avons livré 77 navires aux insurgés américains. Et eux, ces chantres de la liberté, rien. Pas un seul chargement de marchandises promises. Je leur aurais fait des dons.
Louis had hoped for an economic boost from the war, but the Americans had other ideas.
Ils leur auraient fait des dons. Ils ont fait savoir qu'ils n'ont aucune intention de rien rembourser.
The Americans preferred to continue to trade with England, so France actually ended up spending an awful lot of money on a war from which it got very little tangible benefit.
Turgo, the ex-minister of finances, says the first gunshot will drive the state to bankruptcy. Well, he's wrong, but he's only wrong by a few years because the impact of that war on French finances is absolutely terrible.
Necker's successor was Charles Alexandre de Calonne, who proposed a new idea. He told Louis that to boost the French economy, he should spend even more.
Vous voulez faire des dépenses quand ce sont des économies que mes peuples attendent.
L'argent est là, sire. Dans le secret des coffres et des tiroirs. Il faut le faire sortir, mais l'abeille ne fait pas son miel avec du vinaigre. Il faut restaurer la confiance du public. C'est seulement quand les financiers et les épargnants auront le sentiment que l'argent coule à flot qu'ils seront prêts à nous confier le leur. Nous devons faire comme si l'argent ne manquait pas. Et c'est à vous...
Calonne's financial policies aggravate the very serious financial problems of the state to breaking point.
Marie Antoinette had given the French people an heir to the throne, but as an Austrian outsider, she had never been very popular. Now, as the financial crisis deepened, ordinary people came to see her not as their queen, but as a symbol of the selfishness of the aristocratic elite.
It's a truism of history that when there's economic stress, people look round for who to blame, and it was all too easy to blame the Austrian, l'Autrichienne, and that she had an extravagant court, and that country people were starving, and she was having parties and giving balls. So that's really what caused the major downturn in her reputation.
There's a stream of salacious pamphlets which come out about Marie Antoinette in the 1770s and 1780s. The sorts of things that they'd say, that she has a very wild sex life, frustrated in her relations with the king. She has sexual relations with his brothers. She's the new Messalina. She's the new sort of sexually wild person at court. And this is dragging the monarchy down.
Pour moi, je me suis habituée à tout. On m'a prêté des amants, on me prête désormais des maîtresses. Cela me serait indifférent si l'on ne cherchait ainsi à vous atteindre à travers moi.
One of the innuendos was that Marie Antoinette had an affair with Cardinal de Rohan, who was the court almoner, and he then passed venereal disease on to every woman in the court. That's the sort of thing that went around. It was very gross. The grosser the better.
They make anything that people may put up with today look absolutely mild. They are so gross. They are really lewd, with detail and illustrations. One of the points the satirists made in their pamphlets was that Marie Antoinette had it off with her brother-in-law, the Comte d'Artois. You know, you take a story like she's having it off with her brother-in-law, and then how do you prove she's not? That was the trouble, so everybody liked to believe it. I think the king, who was a very nice man, was very upset by it.
Louis himself was also a victim of the pamphleteers.
Ce sont nos réformes que l'on cherche encore et toujours à abattre. Au reste, voyez ce que l'on fait aujourd'hui de moi. Petit, gros, idiot, empoté, dormeur, buveur, cochon, n'ayant d'autre intérêt que la chasse et la serrurerie, il semble qu'il n'y ait personne moins fait que moi pour diriger la France.
Il suffit d'un ordre, sire, et nous ferons cesser ces publications et punir les coupables.
Non. Non, je ne veux pas que quiconque soit poursuivi en mon nom.
From everything that he read, Louis assumed that the whole country now despised him. But a visit to Normandy to inspect a new port brought a pleasant surprise.
Nous n'attendions plus que votre majesté pour procéder à l'immersion du 9e cône qui servira de...
For the rest of his career, he virtually never goes out of the area around Paris. It's almost the only time he sees the rest of his country. And what it shows is he is incredibly popular. There's a sort of popularity which he is utterly unsuspecting of, and he even ends up cheering and clapping himself in the excitement.
He was much applauded in Normandy, and it is said that as he was getting back to Versailles, he said, "I know I'm getting nearer to Versailles because the chairs are much weaker."
As soon as he returned to his court, Louis faced another crisis. Finance Minister Calonne decided that his spend, spend, spend formula had been wrong after all. Now he called for cuts and new taxes for the nobility, the same advice that his ill-fated predecessors had given. And sure enough, the nobles organized themselves to resist taxation all over again.
1787 and 1788 will be characterized by a state that's desperate for financial reform to get out of the situation of bankruptcy which is staring it in the face.
Vous nous entraînez dans la dépense pour ensuite adopter la politique de Necker ou de Turgot.
C'est que ces réformes que le bon sens commande sont indispensables à votre royaume, sire.
Louis believed that Calonne's medicine could save France, but doubted if the patient would ever be prepared to swallow it.
Vous connaissiez la violence des oppositions que nous allions lever contre un tel plan. Comment comptez-vous le faire adopter quand nous savons que Parlement, clergé, noblesse vont se liguer contre?
And it's going to be absolutely vital that Louis XVI, for once in his life, follows through and supports his minister in order to make sure that these plans are accepted, because there is no plan B.
Messieurs, l'opposition réitérée des parlements à tous nos projets de réforme m'a déterminé à suivre les conseils de M. Calonne. Je suis résolu de convoquer le plus rapidement possible l'Assemblée des notables.
The Assembly of Notables included all the most powerful figures in Louis's realm. They had the authority to see that Calonne's reforms became the law of the land.
Messieurs les notables, les projets qui vous seront communiqués de ma part sont grands et importants.
Calonne's reforms will be introduced to them. They will give it their endorsement, thus showing a degree of almost national support, and the king would go on happily. Of course, it doesn't happen like that. The Assembly of Notables turns into an absolute bear garden, an absolute dogfight.
What Calonne was doing was asking an assembly of privileged people to vote away their own privileges. In other words, asking turkeys to vote early for Christmas. And so inevitably they rejected it.
The king realizes that Calonne has failed to persuade the political elite to go down his route. He gets sacked. The ideas which he proposes are withdrawn. So it's a pretty unmitigated disaster.
Calonne was the third finance minister to fall from grace after trying to make the rich pay more tax. And the third that Louis had supported, only to sack. Trapped between economic disaster and the implacable opponents of change all around him, the king couldn't cope anymore. he suffered a mental breakdown, stumbling around his palace, rambling about the visions that tormented him.
N'ayant plus rien à y mettre, j'en ai fait coudre les poches. Malheureux, cela vous épargnera de les plaindre.
Vous n'êtes que chiant-lit.
Just as his grandfather, Louis XV, was subject to melancholia and depression, Louis XVI seems to enter into a period of really quite deep depression.
Puisque c'est comme ça.
The failure of the Assembly of Notables seems to have affected Louis XVI very badly. He's unable to manage the court and to manage the political situation in a way that he has to do as a king, because he is at the pinnacle of a system which is itself in crisis.
Je vais faire connaître au public nos véritables intentions.
In some respect, from this moment, he lost the control. This was a key moment where his ability to actually be a king and dominate the political agenda was put under question.
Est-ce bien le moment?
Je suis désormais comme un équilibriste sur sa corde raide. Si je fais un pas à gauche, je tombe, un pas à droite, je tombe aussi.
Louis, c'est à vous de prendre les mesures. C'est à vous d'imposer vos vues.
After the Notables, Louis XVI exhibits the qualities that have gone down the Louis of history. You know, tearful, uxorious, reliant on Marie Antoinette, kindly, indecisive, all that. And there are lapses of reason, which are very unfortunate for the people who have to be with him.
Louis's mental state was hardly improved when somebody sneaked into his private chamber and left him an unwelcome gift: a portrait of the execution of England's king, Charles I.
Louis XVI was dominated by the life of Charles I, who was his direct ancestor. He knew bit by bit, line by line, what happened to Charles. And so people were able to scare him by moving a portrait of the king into his private apartments. But Louis, who had a very sort of mechanical kind of mind, he said, if I avoid the mistakes that Charles made, I won't be executed. He said, Charles was executed because he levied war on his own subjects. I'm not going to do that.
Louis recovered his composure and tried one last time to change the way his kingdom was taxed and governed. He called an unprecedented meeting of all three estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate, who represented the mass of the common people.
Messieurs, ce jour que mon cœur attendait depuis longtemps est enfin arrivé.
In August 1788, the Treasury was bare. The government was forced to summon an Estates General. It really was a last throw of a dice.
Despite their huge numerical superiority, the votes of the Third Estate only counted the same as those of the nobility and the clergy.
You will always have a situation where the two votes of the so-called privileged orders, that is the nobility and the clergy, representing maybe less than 500,000 people, will always outweigh the wishes of the 27.5 million people of the Third Estate. So straight away, you've got a political deadlock as soon as the Estates General meet. And getting out of that deadlock will be what happens over the summer of 1789 that triggers the revolution.
A difficult time grew even worse for Louis and Marie Antoinette, with the death of their eldest son.
maximam misericordiam adiuvete Dominus gratia spiritus sancti.
The death of the Dauphin, the young heir to the throne, is quite a big psychological shock, actually. The king is met by a tremendous amount of support from the nobility. Psychologically, it draws the king and his nobility closer together in a way.
It was a crucial moment. Louis's sudden shift in sympathy back to the nobles meant that their enemies, the representatives of the Third Estate, decided he was never going to help them.
The king is increasingly finding it difficult to distance himself from his nobles and their interests. That's the world he moves in. Versailles is all about being surrounded by nobles. He's hardly ever met his own subjects out of that context. So he's swaying towards supporting the nobles, and Marie Antoinette certainly is swaying towards them.
Souvenez-vous de ce que vous avez dit le jour où vous êtes devenu roi.
Mon Dieu, je n'ai pas voulu cela.
Et le jour où vous avez reçu la couronne?
Mon Dieu, qu'elle est lourde.
With negotiations at the Estates General still hopelessly bogged down, the Third Estate sent a group to Versailles to ask for Louis's help.
Sire, ces messieurs du tiers-état souhaiteraient vous voir.
He refused to meet them. It was the final straw.
The Third Estate takes matters into its own hands and declares itself the National Assembly. And this is absolutely critical because it's the first time in modern European history that a representative body has claimed power in the state based on a democratic principle that it represents 80% of the French people.
It was a genuinely radical, revolutionary moment because they were saying they were not going to disperse until France had been given a constitution.
De par le roi, annule comme illégale la délibération du 17 juin par laquelle le tiers-État a pris le titre d'Assemblée nationale. Le roi vous ordonne, messieurs, de vous disperser immédiatement.
C'est la voix de la nation.
Faced with the crumbling of the structure of the old Estates General, Louis XVI decided finally that he would resort to force. As a result, he began to call in troops and to assemble troops around Paris. The whole business was botched. The Parisians, panicked by rapidly rising food prices, decided to defend themselves. As a result, they attacked the Bastille to get the powder.
Fusil volé, la prison de la Bastille prise d'assaut, le gouverneur assassiné, sa tête portée sur une pique dans tout Paris. Et vous avez laissé le roi dans l'ignorance?
Louis was woken in the middle of the night with the news that his people had finally taken up arms against the authorities.
Louis XVI had a choice.
Faites réveiller ceux qui dorment. Je veux tout le monde au conseil.
He could have tried to face down the people of Paris and the National Assembly by force of arms. In other words, he could have risked civil war. If there is one thing that is clear about Louis XVI, is that he refused to take that path. He would not fight or raise his standard against his own people. He knew his English history. He knew what had happened to Charles I. He had no intention of repeating it.
Louis may not have wanted to go to war with his own people, but many of them now wanted to go to war with him. 3 months after the fall of the Bastille, a group of angry Parisians marched on Versailles itself.
Et la foule est armée. On crie partout « À mort l'Autrichienne » et l'on se promet, pardonnez-moi, sire, de faire rôtir son cœur.
the rioters vowed to kill the one person they blamed for all their troubles, the symbol of the hated rich, Marie Antoinette.
There's no doubt that some elements of this crown had very bloodthirsty thoughts in their mind. Marie Antoinette has become a figure of absolute hatred for the population of Paris at this point.
Marie Antoinette was the main target because she's been the main target for many years now. She was considered that the person really was giving poor advice to Louis XVI, who had been at the origin of fiscal crisis because of her lavish expenses.
One reason the crowd hated Marie Antoinette was because of a phrase she was said to have uttered when told that the poor had no bread. Qu'ils mangent de la brioche? Let them eat cake.
Marie Antoinette never said, let them eat cake, and she never could have said it. She was brought up in the philanthropic court of Austria, where her mother, Maria Theresa, sort of told them to go around giving soup and bread to old women in farmers' cottages. And it was inconceivable. She would have given the brioche. She was much more like the late Princess Diana, you know. She would have performed a gesture like that. So she could never have said it.
Whoever said what or when, the revolutionaries were after the Queen's blood and were soon breaking down the palace gates.
They broke in the early morning and they tried to climb in the room of Marie Antoinette.
One of her bodyguards is killed actually defending the entrance to her chamber in the palace, massacred there and then. Marie Antoinette only escapes by a rapid exit into the king's chamber. It is a very, very dangerous moment for the royal family. There was no doubt they must have been terrified. And the king and the queen and their children go out onto the balcony to show themselves, in a sense, to show that they're prisoners and are not fleeing.
Mes amis, j'irai à Paris avec ma femme et mes enfants. C'est à l'amour de mes bons et fidèles sujets que je confie ce que j'ai de plus précieux.
It must have been an absolutely terrifying moment for the king, the queen, and their children, because the crowd is fearsome. They're not used to coming into contact with people like this.
The entire royal family surrendered itself to the revolutionary crowd and agreed to be taken as prisoners to Paris. None of them would ever see Versailles again.
Famille royale, regardez-les.
Affameur!
Regarde ton peuple, roi! Affameur du peuple. Le peuple français meurt de faim.
They were taken back as the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's son, in reference to the grain and bread crisis that had triggered this. But it's fair to say that after the 6th of October, the king and the royal family were prisoners of the revolution.
Louis had tried and failed to change his kingdom. Now he would pay the price. Both he and Marie Antoinette would die under the blade of the guillotine. For over 100 years, Versailles stood for the power and prestige of the Bourbon dynasty. But it also stood for a society that was fundamentally unfair and corrupt. Romantic, but royally debauched. Glittering, but grotesquely unequal. Magnificent, but profoundly immoral. A society whose time was up.